Okay, everyone, let's make a start. So welcome, thanks for coming to the first in this series of the New Economics briefings on organising for the end of furlough. My name is Becki Winson and I'm a senior organiser here at the New Economics Foundation, or NEF. For those of you who don't know, NEF is a think tank working to build a new economy for people and planet. It's really exciting to have so many people from across the union movement and beyond and up and down the country, as I can see, and from outside the country on the call this evening. So welcome again. Please do say who you are and where you're calling in from in the chat box. If you're a member of a trade union, why not give them a shout out too? If you enjoy this briefing, then please let us know by tweeting about it with the hashtag NEFbriefing to help spread the word. You can already sign up for next week's briefing, which will be in partnership with the Patients Not Passports campaign, and which is on healthcare and COVID in the hostile environment. We'll post a link for that in the chat now. So as we all know, the government's furlough scheme will begin to unwind from August, and it's scheduled to end altogether on October the 31st. As firms have to bear a higher share of costs, it's expected that redundancies are going to be rising. And unless some urgent action is taken, some reports suggest that unemployment is likely to soar to between 1.5 and 3.1 million by the end of 2021, with some sectors, including hospitality and the creative industries, set to be hit especially hard. Women workers and workers of colour, who are more likely to be poorly paid in insecure work than their white male counterparts, are also disproportionately at risk from what's to come. Of course, all of this tells a story of attacks on workers' rights and trade union organising, which have been happening in the UK and across the world going back decades. The rise of insecure, low-paid jobs in the UK in response to the last major economic crisis of 2008 is a prime example of that. So we have to get organised now for what's to come. Over the last few months, we've seen the union movement securing huge wins. Some unions have seen a really sharp increase in membership. Others have developed innovative ways of organising during a pandemic, and others, like the NEU, have had real victories in changing government policy to protect their workers and the public. So, what challenges and opportunities does the end of furlough create for organising workers? What tactics have been used to win recent campaigns, and what can we learn from them? How can the union movement work together now to protect jobs and build power in workplaces and communities beyond the pandemic? To answer those questions and more, I'm joined by four incredible speakers this evening. First, we're going to hear from labour organiser and migrant rights activist Valery Alzaga. Valery is going to talk us through some of the big picture challenges being posed to unions at the moment, and also some of the opportunities for organising now. Then we're going to hear from Scotland organiser for the GMB, Hazel Nolan. Hazel is going to talk us through some of the recent campaigns wins for GMB and what we can learn from them. Then we're going to dive down into some specific issues faced by workers in a deeply affected sector with equality and diversity organiser at Equity, Ian Manborde. Ian is going to talk about the threats to workers in the creative industries and how we can show solidarity with them. And then finally, we're going to hear from Independent Workers of Great Britain President Chango Lopez. Henry's going to talk to us about how all of this intersects with race and migration and draw on some examples from IWGB campaigns. Whilst I'm really excited to hear from speakers who represent a broad span of union movement this evening, I do want to acknowledge that ideally we would have liked to have been joined by some rank and file workers and reps who are involved in a campaign. We've done our best to ensure that the speakers genuinely represent the workers they organise with, but we'd also really love to hear from you if you are a worker affected by any of these issues and you're on this call. Please do post any information about campaigns or calls to action in the chat as that call goes on. And similarly, if you've any questions for speakers, please post in the chat as they're talking and we'll do our best to ask them. We're aiming to wrap up around 8 p.m. this evening, so we're not going to be able to get round to everyone, but we'll try our best to pick the most relevant questions. Great. Okay, so let's get started with our first speaker, Labour Movement Organiser Valery Alzaga. Valery, thanks so much for joining us. Please, could you give us a bit of a picture about what's to come for unions? What problems should unions be thinking about now? And what are some of the ways you think the union movement could respond to this crisis?
Yeah, so hi everybody. Saludos, nice to meet everybody. Well, I wanted to take a bit of a step back, right? I mean, I work for the public sector union, so obviously we're not being as affected as other sectors, but we will because there is an austerity to come in which our own members will be laid off. So it's important to understand that the government is actually doing furlough, not because they're nice, but because they have to, because they understand that in the long term, if they don't do this, it was actually going to be worse for the economy, right? So I do think that they're susceptible to public pressure, and it's important to understand that. I know the Tories are split on this, but it is an important question if this furlough can actually be fought to be continued. And I want to just to make sure that, again, this is for their own good. This is not because they're benevolent, but that also gives us an opportunity. So, ending the furlough for us, obviously there is going to be a spike in unemployment. And for small and medium-sized companies, there's going to be a serious bankruptcy process, right? We are expecting a lot of consolidation of markets and more monopoly of the bigger companies. So that is going to also, I think, in the long term affect the market. We also know that massive unemployment means pressure on wages, right? Because there will be so many people needing jobs that usually suppresses wages in the long term. And as in particular, there's also going to be a lot of debt, right? Personal debt, as well as other kinds of debts that we're gonna have to face. And that's an important question, and I'll come back to it as well. We are gonna see a lot of other fights going on, and that's an important backdrop to what we need to do as unions. Obviously, in terms of workers, I mean, there's going to be a lot of negotiations. And for a lot of unemployed folks that are in trade unions that have bargaining contracts or the ability to negotiate, we want to make sure that there are agreements for what we call return to work, right? That this is not an opportunity for companies to lay off a bunch of people and then open basically those jobs again, forsaking everybody that has accumulated benefits and seniority and so on. So we gotta make sure that once this economy is actually back in order, or as things get better, we have right to return for union members and seniority rights. That's an important consideration. The other thing that I would say is that for unions, obviously, it means membership drop. And so we need to be very careful about what is it that, although we're growing in membership, some of us will be losing membership as well. And so we got to look at what that means for our ability to invest in fights and our ability to invest in organizing. And obviously, the big opportunity here is to fight, right? I mean, what worries us is that unions are going to just be basically kind of very defensive and regressive and inward looking, right? Because we're worried about our own economic survival. And the truth of the matter is that this is a very interesting crisis because it's also an opportunity to organize and grow and fight in a different way, not only for ourselves, but because our members are renters and because they're mortgage holders and because there is other fights that are going to be happening as unemployed folks are going to be looking at many different fights, right? We're not only workers. We're renters, we're mothers, we are consumers. We have a lot more power and we occupy many more spaces. So the idea is, can unions also fight for housing rights? Can we fight with other movements? One, to actually push for furlough to be elongated, because that's important and that's effective, or for more unemployment benefits, right? So we need to look not only at protecting ourselves in the workplace, but also progressive unions need to think about how to push further and how to do big fights and stand with housing rights and stand with other fights, right? Migrant rights, etc. Why? Because that's our membership, and we need to think about ourselves not in a just, oh, I'm a worker, but we occupy so many spaces. I do think that crisis is going to give us the opportunity to pivot a different kind of social and labor movement. And for me, this is the moment to see if unions are going to be, again, inward looking or really take the opportunity of the crisis. To anticipate that and to think about it, I mean, in Spain, La Paz, right, the mortgage holders were able to actually organize huge movements. And then the mayor of Barcelona comes out of those fights. So I do think that we're in a moment in which the unemployment and the crisis will open up a lot of different fights. And I hope the unions are there to make sure we are with everybody else. If I can get one more minute, I just wanted to reflect a little bit upon upon history, right? Because the truth of the matter is that in the past, in the Great Depression, you know, in places like New York City, the CP and other organizations were really able to think outside the box, right? As unemployment happened in the trade unions, what they did is that they actually made workers, you know, they took the time to train, retrain, do political education, and organize not only in the workplace, but also in the neighborhoods, against evictions, and as consumers, against, you know, to try to lower food prices, and also, you know, do kind of like, you know, not just see unemployed, you know, as some passive, you know, entity, but also an agency of social change. So they did unemployment councils. I'm hoping, and I hope that the labor movement does involve and invest in what I would say an unemployment movement, but that's hard to say, and hopefully we will be looking at that. There is many more fights to come, at least in the public sector. We are going to have to fight hard on employment and austerity, and I hope we can just do this with everybody else. So thank you. That's it for me.
Thanks so much, Valery. I think we've got time for maybe one or two follow-up questions. There were some submitted before we kicked off the event, and then there's some in the chat box at the moment. There's one, I think sums up a few people's sort of questions. You know, there's been a history in the UK trade union movement, or some bits of it, of like you said, like not particularly always being outward looking, and so and not maybe innovating in the way that's needed. What do you think would need to change within the movement for it to take that innovative approach to like organising unemployed workers or organising around community issues?
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, I think some unions have experimented with resource centers, more kind of like community centers, right? Like unions have tried to be in community. And yet, I mean, I think we're seeing very interesting kind of attempts. Like in the United States, there is the bargaining for the common good approach and network, which is like the idea that we need to work and bargain collectively with other movements for the common good. That if we don't do that, if we don't make alignments, it's going to be much harder. I think the neoliberal governments, right, have a much more, you know, I'm sure right now they're thinking through how we're going to privatize the NHS, how are we going to do this, how are we going to that, and that they have plans. And in a way, we right now need to think about that alignment. What is it about trade unions and social movements and housing rights movements and migrant rights movements? What is it, and where do we come together and fight? You know, whether it's that's on preserving services that are going to be actually for everybody, fighting for more safety nets, coming to this, I would argue, a very deep economic crisis that is to come. And so for me, I think part of the conversations is that, you know, we need to think outside the box. And I don't know, I mean, I think that's the question of the future of unions here. I think several unions have always gestured to this. And I think this is an opportunity to think about and being, you know, like in a way taking not this as a risk, but as an investment on the kind of social and labor movement we want to see. This is a moment to build that. And I do think we as members and as staff and as people inside, we need to keep pushing that idea. But other countries are really trying to experiment with that. And also because it makes sense to win, right? Like we're not going to win divided. And this is something that obviously in the labor movement we know very well. Yeah. I don't know if that answers that question.
Thanks so much, Valery. It's really great to hear from you. We're going to move on now to our next speaker, who is Hazel Nolan, GMB Scotland Organiser. So Hazel, you've recently been involved in some successful campaigns with GMB Scotland. Could you talk us through those a bit and what the lessons are that you think we should learn from them?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much, Becki, for letting me do this panel. It's great to hear from all the speakers. I thought Valery was really inspiring, and I wanted to pick up on some of the things that she mentioned at the end. In Glasgow, or in GMB Scotland, we've been really trying to foster a very different culture within our region up here, and that is to get back to the basic bones of organising. And, you know, Valery mentioned something that was really good, but like how can unions extend into the community? And you know, it's true, like we're voters and we're also renters. in G&B Scotland recently, like we've been working really effectively with Living Rent. I don't know if people have heard of the Living Rent campaign, with tenants and our refuse workers and our refuse workers reps and members have been doing that. It's been quite successful, and that's a really great initiative. The thing I would say about it though is that before you can get to that stage, you have to first have a relationship between your union and your union members. And the reality is that relationship in a lot of areas has totally broken down, and it broke down a very long time ago. So before we earn the right to talk to our own trade union members about the importance of engaging with campaigns about renting and about voting and everything else, we need to earn the right to talk to them, because we lost that, and lots of unions lost that a long time ago, and it's about rebuilding those relationships. And the reason why we've been able to do that in Glasgow is largely because we've changed our union culture up here. You know, we ran the Glasgow women's strike back in 2018, where 8,000 low-paid women workers went out on strike, and we're talking about caterers, cleaners, and home carers predominantly, right? And also teaching assistants. And what that showed is that too often unions rely on the law, you know, to kind of help them. And that's a really big point that I wanted to make tonight, because, you know, the law is not on the side of workers. And one of the things that kind of gave me a bit of fear recently was looking at people on Twitter and on social media who are organisers saying, you know, oh, just quote section 44 of the Employment Act 1996, everything will be totally fine. And the reality is, like, that is not the case, you know, unless you have like a proper organization behind you and you're organized, then there's no point over relying on legislation. But those things can be a powerful combination if you go back to union basics, you know, because we're talking about a post-COVID world now, and the reality is that how power works in the workplace has never changed, and it's not ever going to change either. And our job is to understand that and understand how we're building power for workers. And then we can start to look at how we can utilize things like legislation and all the other tools that are available to us. But that bit has to come first. And that is about rebuilding those relationships, rebuilding that sense of community. And so different ways that we have been doing that is we've been doing a lot of work on care in G&B Scotland. And we ran a really successful campaign during COVID by engaging with our members, right, in order to get the Scottish Government to develop a support fund which would cover sick pay, because we were talking constantly about PPE, and of course that was extremely important, and we were also talking about testing. But by listening to our members, we realized in that situation, actually they were terrified of getting tested, because once they got tested for COVID, and if they got a positive result, they would have to go back on statutory sick pay, and that this was actually preventing loads of carers from going out and doing that, and that was exasperating the problem, you know. But you only kind of get to the bones of that by building up on those relationships again. One of the things I'm really excited about that we've done in our region is we've actually set up a women's campaign unit to look at all these different issues about how women are being discriminated against, and how do we use our industrial muscle to solve these problems. Because too often in the trade union movement, we like to talk about, you know, like we all like to talk about our equality structures in trade unions, but it's kind of seen as an added on extra. And I find that extremely frustrating, because we wouldn't lobby for better pay. We would go out and fight and industrially bargain and negotiate for it and campaign for it. But when it comes to things that affect women or affect different people from different equality strands, often we want a campaign that's about lobbying the employer. You know, why are these not built into our bargaining agenda? And that those are the kind of things that we're doing. And I don't think that we're actually doing anything that radical in Scotland. We're just trying to go back to the basics of it. And you know, like myself and a lot of the organisers that work in G&B Scotland, like we've been extremely inspired by the work of people like Jane McAlevey, and looking about how we do go back to that type of organising, and Marshall Gantz as well, you know, and like it all relies on how you're building those senses of communities. And I pick up on a couple of things that on that, you know, there's been a lot of talk about like a Green New Deal and a green recovery. I organised a workers' occupation in 2007, where while the Scottish First Minister was at a renewables conference in Bonn, the only yards in Scotland that have any sort of work on the renewables industry ended up facing liquidation. and we had to organize with the workers to occupy those yards, and ran a huge campaign on it, you know, and it was one of the first like worker occupations we'd had in Scotland in a generation, and it was successful because we went back to old school organizing. And you look at the traditional sectors that are starting to lose wages and lose terms and conditions. Like, I'm also organizing in British Gas at the moment. British Gas nationally have served, have basically going to fire and rehire all of their workforce. You know, it's the exact same stuff as BA, and they're trying to blame it on COVID, and people are going to try and do that. And really, like, unions need to start thinking very clearly about like what are their asks during this, you know. The reality is there are going to be lots of companies out there that are facing a massive decline, you know. How are we going to build our way back up from that, you know, like, because, you know, what are we willing to accept, what are we not willing to accept? And what I would say to that is that's not the job of organisers to decide that, it's the job of members, because you can only negotiate to the power of the membership at the end of the day. I'm going to try and keep the time, and I'm usually like terrible at doing that, so I think I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, thanks so much, Hazel. So there's a few sort of follow-up questions that I think I've just seen being posted in the document I'm looking at. You know, I think there's a few questions around this in the chat box, and I'd be really interested to know as well. You know, I know you did that great organising work around like occupying those works, and what happens when like an industry like that goes into liquidation. It seems to me like that's something that we're really likely to be facing across different sectors and industries over the next few years. And it would be really good to hear a bit from you about like what that looks like for a worker, and like, you know, what maybe some of the organising obstacles are when, you know, you're organising a workplace where the threat of there being no workplace at all is a really real threat.
Yeah. So one of the things I always try and do in my campaigns is talk about the emotional story of workers, right? And I think that too often, and I don't know if it comes from a place of insecurity, but like broadly on the left, we rely so much on statistics, right? Because we think that like we just need to prove our point, and actually the right don't do that, you know. They talk in emotional terms all the time, and I'm always interested in why that is, you know. And if you look at like the debate about immigration, you know, it wasn't until that picture of that toddler washed up on a beach that for a moment in the UK at least, and it didn't last forever, but for a few weeks, there was a kind of a pause. When I ran a campaign in Glasgow, in BIFAB, it was called Battle for BIFAB for anyone who's interested in looking at it. I interviewed a lot of the workers, and I said to them, you know, what does having a job here mean for you? You know, and I'll never forget, there was this guy who said to me, I have a 7-year-old son, and I've had to travel all over the world to try and get work as a scaffolder. And this place being open means I get to tuck my child into bed every night. And at the end of the campaign, you know, like that just was so powerful to me. Like when we marched the workers, we marched them in the front of the march, and we got them to get their kids out of school and carry signs saying, you know, like save daddy's work. And it was really powerful. And I remember at the end of it, you know, we won that because there was a really good response from the community as well. And the reality is that for a lot of people, their industry is also their sense of identity. And I think we've just completely forgotten that, you know, like if you go into areas like Sunderland, you know, like what they did is how they identify themselves. When I introduce myself, I say I'm a trade union official, I'm a trade unionist, you know, it's not just a thing I do, it's like, it's part of who I am. And I don't want to cut across too much because I think you've got another speaker who's going to talk about that, but like, I just think we forget that, how important that actually is, you know, that to a workforce, because you lose your sense of purpose, and having a sense of purpose is really important. You know, we've even seen that during COVID, people who got furloughed, like there's lots of mental health issues for workers who weren't working, because you get so much of a sense of purpose out of your job as well. To kind of finish up on that story, when we won that campaign, I texted the reps to say, oh, like, you know, we'd had the negotiation with the Scottish government, they're intervening, like we've saved the yards for now. And one of them wrote back to me, and they said, oh, I hope you're out celebrating. And I was like, yeah, of course I am, in the pub, and sent like a selfie of me with a pint and some of my colleagues, right? And this guy who I'd, you know, interviewed earlier in the week, he wrote back to me, he said, this is me celebrating. And he sent me a photograph of him tucking his 7-year-old kid in the bed. And to me, like, that's just so powerful. And I just think, you know, when I talk about rebuilding communities, we are rebuilding relationships, and they need to have meaning. and we need to be able to get that out there. And that is our most powerful thing, you know, because there was a point that Valery touched on about resources, you know, like what are unions going to do when they want, like resource wise, and can they invest in organizing? Well, we can't afford to not invest in organizing. And actually the biggest resource we have is our people and those relationships. And actually doesn't cost that much. It costs a bit of time and it costs effort. But that's what, if we want to win, that's what we have to do.
Thanks so much, Hazel. That was really great. I think it was really good to end on that note that, like, ultimately it's relationships that give unions power, right? Whether that's in the community or in workplaces. Before I move on to our third speaker, I just want to do a quick shout out to all the NEF supporters we've got on the call. Your generosity is helping fund our response to the crisis so far, including helping us to run these briefings. So thanks very much for that. If you're not a NEF supporter and you'd like to become one, then please check out the New Supporters network page on our website. We're posting a link in the chat right now. So we've had an overview of some of the challenges and opportunities posed to unions, and also some lessons for some recent successes. Now let's hear about some of the struggles happening in a deeply affected sector right now. To talk us through this, we are joined by Equality and Diversity Organiser at Equity, Ian Manborde. Ian, hi. Can you talk to us about the specific risks posed to the creative sector by the end of furlough and by what's happened during lockdown? So what demands are being made by Equity and other creative unions, and how can we, as non-creative workers, some of us, show solidarity with you?
Sure, Becky, thank you very much. First of all, thanks to NEF for the invite. And can I just say as well, it's really handy following Valery and Hazel, two great speakers, because I'd just like to draw on a couple of things that they've referred to just to frame what I'm going to talk about. Because ultimately what I'm talking about is organising self-employed workers. Because one of the things about Valery, you referred to a great phrase, it makes sense to win. And it does, doesn't it? You know, if you're organising workers. But what do you do if quite clearly it feels like you're not winning? That's one thing I just want to kind of use as a structure for what I'm going to say. And then Hazel, your point, we all saw the massive references to Section 44 of the Employment Rights Act, didn't we? That's if you're an employee. What if you're a worker? That's one thing. And what if you're a self-employed contractor? And Hazel, I know you know that. That's why you made that point. And so, as a union, I think one of the greatest dilemmas that we faced on lockdown is, what do you do when almost overnight all of your members are out of work? Now, just to be really clear, on any given day, most of our members are out of work as performers, as creatives. They're usually in a second job or they're out of work. So we are technically a union of the unemployed, Valery, which is an interesting point. However, in March, all of our members are out of work on a semi-permanent basis, and most of our members still are. The whole of the summer festival season's gone, all of the Christmas season is gone as well. And as you followed in the press, the slow process of opening up the creative industries is taking a hell of a long time. In reference to the title of this session, though, you know, the end of furlough, most of our members weren't entitled to furlough as self-employed workers, so we're really looking at something else. But I think the important thing in the very first instance, before we look at the transition from lockdown, we've got to deal with the injustice of a situation where far too many self-employed workers fell through the net and received no financial support. And we know from our own data that's at least 30% of our members, and freelancers across the sector. So you won't be surprised to hear that we're backing, for example, the demand for a judicial review by Pregnant Then Screwed of the particular discrimination that women face who took maternity leave during the calculation period for the self-employed income support scheme. And just this week, the National Union of Journalists, one of our sister unions in the Federation of Entertainment Unions, has launched a legal challenge against the overall discrimination of the self-employed income support scheme. So the way in which we must make sure that workers believe that we can win and their union is fighting for them is to be at the very front of those struggles, of those fights. And one of the things, Becky, I wanted to do to talk about how colleagues here can show solidarity is I want to share with you a campaign that we're launching today to put pressure on the Treasury and DCMS in effect, to talk about how that money, that 1.57 billion, which was announced 2 weeks ago, is going to go to workers. How is that going to make a difference to workers? Because our principal concern in the union is that, and particularly in my role as the person responsible for equalities, is what are we going to do to maintain talent? That's one thing overall, while we wait for the sector to pick up. But the concern around equalities is what do we do with those groups who are traditionally underrepresented? They're having to wait for far too long a period of time to wait for the occasion when they might get the chance to get some work. And I think that the concern of the union is that we shift backwards into a situation where the relatively privileged are the ones most likely to be able to withstand a period out of work. And this union has done a huge amount of work focused on class and class bias, and the fact that often it's the very privileged who have the opportunity, some of the best opportunities to be cast in quite high profile performances. And another way of making sure our members feel like that we're winning is to put underrepresented groups at the very forefront of our work. So in terms of the work that's focused on the return to work, particularly TV and film, which has gone back sooner than live performances going back, we've absolutely placed a focus on pushing employers, sorry, that's my timer telling me I'm up already, pushing employers to ensure that no worker is left behind and placing even greater demands on them also. What I'm going to do in the chat is just put the details of this latest campaign of ours in terms of through MPs, a demand on the Treasury and on DCMS for more detail on how workers directly benefit from the rescue package. 5 minutes goes really quickly, doesn't it? But I'll stop there, Becki. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ian, and thanks to you and all the other speakers so far for being so conscious of time. Like, I know full well as a trade unionist how much we like to talk, so I really appreciate it. There are a few questions for you that have come through on email as well as in the chat. First of all, we've got a question from Max at IWGB, I think. What are your key campaign objectives at the moment, and how is it that you're campaigning for those?
So I think, Becki, very much like the item I've just shared in the chat, it's the focus on people, it's the focus on humans. When the government announced the rescue package for cultural industries, it talked about saving the crown jewels. What the Prime Minister was referring to was infrastructure and bricks and mortar. As we all know, all of us have benefited massively from free content during the period of the lockdown. You know, screenings from the National Theatre. All of those productions, as the audience here knows very well, isn't it just about people on stage and screen? It's about the massive volume of people behind that as well. People make the cultural industries. So my answer to Max is, if you have a look at the news item that I've just shared, and it's something called the 4 Pillars package that we have. The 4 Pillars really is about deconstructing our rescue package for the sector, and it focuses on protecting people, and it essentially focuses on that because far too many people have fallen through the cracks between job retention and self-employed income support scheme. But can I say one other thing? It's about Valery's point. We need to make workers who've been massively disadvantaged by the lockdown feeling like they're winning. Thanks, Becki.
Thanks so much. And then just one more question, which has come through. So obviously a lot of people who are maybe an actor or a comedian or a musician, until you get, you know, successful enough to earn a living from that full time, you're working often in other industries, and you're probably working in hospitality or retail or shift work, and they've also been massively affected by lockdown and COVID. I was wondering if there are, you know, are you working with any other unions to support members who are working across two worlds, so to speak, and what does that partnership look like?
Sure, you know, that's a really valid point. We're highly conscious as a union of self-employed workers. This again, Valery, is your point, understanding that workers occupy alternative spaces. I'm not By the way, I'm not claiming equity is brilliant. We will not do everything. But as a union of self-employed workers, you do understand what it takes to survive, what it takes, Becki, as you were saying, to hang on until you get called for that bit of work that might be months after you've been doing other things. So what that work looks like is working through the Federation of Entertainment Unions to back other campaigns of other unions, particularly, for example, in hospitality and catering, particularly around campaigns, even though our members not necessarily work hugely in McDonald's, supporting the Bakers Union campaign in McDonald's, for example, ultimately recognising the different spaces that our members occupy and recognising that we have to provide support for those other movement struggles as well. Because I think one of the greatest challenges in organising self-employed workers is developing that degree of consciousness. And we have to be there to respect and recognise the way in which our members, like all workers do, struggle to survive from day to day, but also in those alternative spaces as well. So it's about just identifying where to place that kind of emphasis in supporting those other campaigns. I think the other thing briefly that I would say as well is not neglecting those alternative spaces that are to do with where women's lives are. So we've placed a focus on supporting recent changes to abortion law in Northern Ireland. It's important that we're seen as a union to recognise that some of our members place a primacy on that because they know they're not going to be possibly getting a lot of work in the entertainment industry. So it's about finding the balance. But you're absolutely right. As a union of self-employed workers, we have to recognise where those other campaigns are that may be of interest to them. Hopefully I've answered your question. I feel like I've just rattled through that.
No, that was great. Thanks so much. And just to say, Ian, full solidarity from everyone on this call to you and your members. And do look on the links that have just been posted in the chat, and you can find out more about equities campaigns. Okay, so we've reached our final speaker for the evening. We may have some time after Henry's finished speaking to take some questions to the wider panel as well as to him. So our final speaker is President of the IWGB, Henry Chango Lopez. Thanks so much for joining us, Henry. We know this crisis has been hitting workers of colour disproportionately hard. How do the threats posed by the end of furlough intersect with race and migration? And where are you seeing this, and where have you seen this in the IWGB's work?
Yeah, hello everybody. Thanks for inviting me here today, and great to be here with all of you. Obviously, as a migrant worker who has been involved in campaigns and fighting for better rights for a long time, and as a member of the IWGB, which is a union that I've been fighting to improve not just the conditions of workers, but pay, but also the discrimination that they face on a daily basis at work, we know perfectly that this situation is not new for us. It's something, and this basically coronavirus situation has exacerbated the problem, and it has exposed the issues to the public domain, where before a lot of people didn't know about the problems that cleaners face or workers who are, for instance, classified as independent contractors, like couriers, like private hat drivers who work for Uber, and all these taxi operators, foster carers who are also like, for instance, not being able to access sick pay, not being able to access their furlough. This situation has been really hard. It has hit the most these workers who have been already on poverty wages with no conditions of employment, such as sick pay, holiday pensions. At the IWGB, we've been working really hard in order to help these workers. We've been challenging the government as well for health and safety regulations to extend, for instance, to workers, not just to employees. We also been having cases against the government for the extension of sick pay for workers, because like some of the workers, for instance, are not able to access sick pay. Like, and most of them are migrant workers who cannot, for instance, work less hours and cannot afford sick pay, are not allowed to have it if they don't qualify for this. And loads of them don't qualify For instance, cleaners who work in the cleaning industry, couriers, many other workers don't have these conditions. So it's been really hard for us, and obviously furlough has been good for some workers, but not for everybody. A lot of companies have decided not to furlough a lot of workers. We've been fighting the union in order to put pressure on the companies. We've been successful in some of the cases, not in all the cases, but we have done a great job in order to force companies to do that. But also, you can see that this situation has been really difficult for migrant workers as well, because, for instance, in universities, we've been fighting to end the second-tier workforce, like the discrimination that they have between outsourced workers and direct employees. If you see, direct employers have been put on furlough, and the employer have put the 20% on top of the wages, whereas you outsourced workers, the employers haven't top up their wages, or some of them been on 0 hours contracts. They, for instance, not even put them on furlough. So we've been putting pressure on the university in order to do that. And obviously furlough now is going to be it's changing, like from July it's changing. And now at the moment, there's a lot of redundancies going on. And most of the workers who are affected are migrant workers, people on low wages, because these companies don't want to pay a penny. And the thing is that, as you see, these workers are already on an insecure employment, and are going to be in a really difficult situation because they don't have, like, for instance, most of them don't have properties. They cannot even access like help from the government if they are out of furlough, because for instance, we represent a lot of workers who don't even speak the language. They cannot even apply for universal credit, for instance. Some of them even don't qualify because they rent only a room, and it's difficult for them. So it's a really difficult situation, and I think, as you see, it's not surprising that a lot of workers and from minority ethnics have died because of coronavirus situation. It's because of all these situations that these workers have been exposed to, not being able to have sick pay, not being able to have wages paid when they've been out of furlough. So there's no surprise that they have been the most affected. Obviously now the furlough is ending. As I said, employers are getting rid of workers. There's a lot of workers been abused by the system that we have in this country because the lack of enforcement in terms of the policies that the government have, because most of the workers don't have protections in terms of if someone get all of their wages, like workers, we have managed to recover thousands of pounds from workers we have been underpaid, companies that haven't paid them, and there's no law that protects these workers. If they are not in a union, there's no one who can help them. And that's the thing, that's the law in this country, and this is something that as unions we've been playing a big part. And in a way, it's been good because a lot of workers have realized that there is unions, and that unions have been putting a lot of pressure on the government in order to implement good policies to protect workers and to help them. In a bad way, obviously there is a lot of workers who have been affected and will be affected by this. So I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done. And as Valery was saying at the beginning, I think it's time to get together and get involved from all organizations, because these workers are going to be affected in many other ways. Some of them will be losing their homes. They want to have a place to live. And once the furlough ends, and as I said, as the government now asking companies to pay taxes and to pay part of the furlough, they don't want to pay anything. As I said before, they don't even want to pay their wages, let alone they're going to be paying them 10% or 20% of their wages. So I think it's very important that we work together, we unite from all the different organizations that are fighting for housing rights, for workers' rights, for migrant rights, and fight together in order to improve the situation and put pressure on the government to implement better policies to help migrant workers and all the workers in general.
Thanks so much, Henry. It's really great to have you speak. I think there's one follow-up question for you here, and then I think we've probably got a bit of time to hear one or two questions for the whole panel. So the question to you, during the crisis, we've seen a lot of people who maybe didn't realise before just how many people were in precarious work situations and suffering because of that. Do you think that any support can be gained by the unions from that new public awareness? And is that something that you think will carry on long term once this crisis ends and most people go back to normal?
I think we need to, now that this situation is over, I think unions need to do a lot of work in order to get back to normal life, but also in order to improve every workplace. As I said, we've been fighting universities in order to end inequality. I think now that this situation has happened, we all need to work together, not just workers who are outsourced, but workers who work directly for institutions in order to create a better workplace, a safe workplace, and a place where everybody have a decent and secure job.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Okay, so we're going to have one quick fire question at the end. Thanks, Henry, for your contribution. It was great. Just to say to everyone else on the call, you can sign the IWGB's petition to end outsourcing at UCL, and you can also write to the UCL Council with your views on this. If you're in London, you can also join a protest to stop the discriminatory congestion charge on minicabs on Tuesday next week. We've posted more info about both in the chat box. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left until our end time of 8. We've got one question that I think would work really well as like a quick question for all panelists. So that is, can everyone still see me? I seem to have frozen.
We can hear you.
Okay, I'm back, I think. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so a question very quickly to each panelist. Just spend no more than like 30 seconds to a minute answering it if you can. Someone on the chat box interested in a really like nitty-gritty response to this question. What are you/your union doing to prepare for the wave of redundancies which are about to hit? What strategies and tactics are you going to use to fight them? And I'm going to go to Valery first because she was our first speaker in the first place.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've been very busy. We are also, I work for Unison in social care in particular. So in the Northwest, we've really been kind of like just managing the health and safety issues, the pressures, the fights on furloughs. So, I mean, I think we do need space to think. And unfortunately, that's the question, People like us that are pro-organizing and are really trying to figure out a way to both change our union internally, but also have the right fights and have fights that are not just defensive and not just reactionary, right? But to think through the different strategies and the different ways in which we can actually position ourselves. I mean, we understand, and in Northwest, we've been doing this very much. I mean, it's been not only a workplace fight, but the repression on workers, in general, in some of our, in some of our sectors is very high to organize in general. I mean, I do think that when furlough ends and when there is unemployment, the question is that these are members that hopefully will come to us or will go to other sectors. And so there are folks to be invested on because there are members and are activists. And I do think that part of the conversation is how do we take that time and offer training and offer organizing and offer different ways of understanding our crisis, because I do think there is a time to reflect. And I think these are ongoing conversations for our trade union right now. And I've been, to be very honest, we've just been surviving and we've grown a lot, as you know, most of us have grown, and that's obviously the good news, is that people understand in moments of crisis, trade unions are probably the only way in the workplace, but also outside of the workplace to fight the politics, And to me, I think we have to kind of make that shift. This is not, we're talking about furlough. We're not talking just about organizing our own people. These are our people that are going to be out of work. So it does mean a political fight. It means us having to occupy space. It means us having to lobby. It means us having to do the push, on a government that is not going to be our friend. So to me, I do think that the fortunate piece is that I think more people are going to aggregate out of fear. We need to go from fear, which is a normal moment. We're going to go through that fear in order to think of organizing, and in order to think on organizing in very complex situations. I mean, Ian and myself and Hazel, we're sitting in very complex sectors. I mean, social care is devastated already by equity funds, right? We have leakages and we have all types of shit, right? Breaking those sectors anyway. This is a chance for us to think about, when that hit comes, when that austerity comes, when furlough ends, when our people are unemployed, what does that mean? We need to fight the actual structural problems, and yes, we can repair and we can deploy, and the government will give some things on retraining and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, what's wrong is the system, and how the public sector and how workers' rights and how the precarity of folks, right? Not having universal income for the creative sector, etc. I mean, there are things that we can dream about. So, there's a lot of things we can do, but this is a political fight. Let's not bullshit ourselves. We gotta fight the political fight to make sure the safety nets are, one, increased, and two, protected, because I think they're gonna come after them even worse than we are now. And I do think that then the unions, all of us together, have to actually come out and have to do that political fight that Ian is talking about, because this will include a lot of our members and a lot of our neighbors and a lot of our friends. And this is going to be a big thing that is going to impact us, not only in the workplace, but again, in our daily lives. So, the fight is coming. We got to get our heads up, our backs up, and fight, and I do think that some of us are trying to do it in the unions we have, and the unions are not perfect, but we are pushing in the right direction when it comes to, getting ready. I think we have to do and think more, Becki. That definitely is for sure, and push each other to be brave. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That is an amazing contribution. Don't fight redundancies, fight the system that causes them as well. Brilliant. Okay, so we've only got 5 minutes left. So I'm just going to ask each of the remaining speakers to be as brief as possible with the same question. What is maybe even just one of the tactics you're thinking about taking in order to fight redundancies or to protect your members? Hazel, I'm going to go to you next because you were the second speaker.
I guess very briefly, I mean, as an organizer for G&B, I cover everything from frontline workers in social care to gas engineers in the gas industry. And it really depends, my frontline workers in care, they've not been on furlough, right? They've been working round the clock, nonstop the whole way through. I think we're in danger sometimes of looking at structures to deliver change instead of our actual organizing networks. And that is a really important point I do think we need to make, structures need to change, but they're not going to deliver the change. And then secondly, I think we need to be really clear about what our asks are, and the reality is that in some areas, workers are going to take a hit. But what we've done in the past is we've made a mistake where we've given in when a company is going through a downturn. Workers will say, right, well, I might take a pay cut, and then what happens is the company goes back into profit, and that margin is maintained or grows further, right? So one of the demands that we will be making and that we're going to be trying to argue for is actually to change that, make sure that we keep our bargaining in place. And our power to fight back when there is an upturn as well. I think that's super important.
Thanks so much, Hazel. So, Ian, I'm going to ask the same question as you, although I understand it's different given so many of your members.
So on that technical point, our members wouldn't face redundancy. They're contracted on very short periods of work, which then end. But just a couple of things. First of all, I do want to come back to Valery. Always handy to go after Valery and Hazel. I must always ask you two to speak before me on anything. We have to have an alternative vision here. So, for example, I'll answer the question in a second, Becki, I promise. We're a union where our members are regularly asked to work for nothing. They're told your future rests on being in this film or being in this play or doing something else. That has to stop. No more business as usual. It cannot continue. It's a major fault line in this sector, the fact that our members' overall income is so low. That's why they fell through the safety nets, because they're asked to be paid nothing or paid very low. But the answer to the question is, this sector's too big to fail. I'm not saying by virtue of that we should be bailed out a bit like the banks, but film, TV, live performance like theatre and music, can we really see a country being divorced of those cultural entities? We're hammering away hard at the government as part of the rescue package, but the other infrastructure here is local authorities will not want to see their cultural quarters evaporate. If you think about the cities like Bristol and Glasgow and Manchester and those other cities, will not want to see the cultural heart of those cities, including the museums as well, go. Because can you imagine what those cities would look and feel like? So that's why, Valery, you're right to talk about a bigger landscape here, both on the political front in terms of the arguments that we make that underpin the problems that our sectors face anyway. But Becki, the answer to our question is this isn't the union's fight alone. This is society's fight about what culture means to all of us. So yeah, sorry, hopefully a good quick answer to that question. Thank you.
That was great. So Henry, you last. What specific tactics are IWGB going to try and employ to fight that wave of redundancies and cuts that's about to hit us?
Yeah, I think this is a difficult question because obviously at this moment in time, a lot of employers are taking advantage of what is happening with the crisis and all this, and they're not having business and stuff. But I think it's good that we need to target especially those wealthy employers who have the means to protect workers and as well to, you know, at the moment they're firing people, so there are wealthy employers who can keep workers until October at least, and then we can see what we can do. But I think we need to start a campaign on name and shame all those employers who are able to keep workers but they don't want to. But this is something that we need to do. Petitions as well, which is important, and involve politicians, involve the public, and everybody should be involved in this in order to put pressure on all these employers who are trying to take advantage of the situation. But hopefully this situation ends soon, this crisis, and we are back. So we need to do what IWGB has been doing, taking to the streets and going outside their workplaces, stand up and basically shame them on their doorsteps. Thanks.
Thanks so much. That was great. So thanks so much to all our speakers tonight. I hope everyone's enjoyed this as much as I have. This has been a really amazing hour. You can sign up for next week's briefing on healthcare, COVID and the hostile environment. This is the same time next week, and that event is going to platform migrant organisations and campaigners discussing the impact of the hostile environment on migrants' access to healthcare during the pandemic and beyond. We'll post a link for that in the chat now. And also do keep an eye out for NEF's other work with unions. We're fighting for improvements to workers' rights, conditions and pay across the whole shebang of society. So as well as releasing some papers on specific things like outsourcing and union rights over the next few months, we're going to be working with a number of unions to host trainings and workshops, and we'd love as many trade unionists as possible to be involved in that. It will be an open process. So if you'd like to be kept up to date on that, please email me at rebecca.winson@neweconomics.org, or you just sign up to the mailing list for our website. We've just posted some more details in the chat. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon. And I just want to remind everyone, get involved in your trade union, join one if you're not already in one, be brave, think big and keep fighting. And I think we'll be all right in the end. So good night, everyone.